podcasting is all about humans talking to humans. We do forget that.
Courtney, how do you do it? How do you rank so often, so high?
Let me caveat this and say the charts are not the ultimate end-all be-all measure of success for your podcast.
When we launched them and we ranked, what can they hope for after?
The name of the game is attract and retain. That's how we grow a listener base. If you're really good at attracting, but you're not good at retaining, you have no way to grow. If you're really good at retaining, but you're not good at attracting, you have no way to grow.
If I don't enjoy the process of creation, then nothing comes out and then I don't help anybody.
How many businesses are created because it solved a problem that you had?
How do you get people to actually move from the platform to take action?
Look, this is going to sound so generic because a lot of people talk about this, but a lot of people are not doing this.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Content is Profit. Today we have a special guest. This person we met in one of our masterminds, and we hopped on a couple of calls to help each other out. And she's so good at growing, promoting, and ranking podcasts. And to be completely honest, her frameworks and strategies and tactics work for any kind of content. This person has been working more than 7 years in marketing and business psychology. This is so awesome. That's her unique superpower. Through her company, PodLaunch, she has helped more than 60 business owners and experts learn how to rank their podcasts in top 100. In fact, 95% of her clients break the Apple top 100 and scale 5 times faster. By the way, like I said before, these principles work in any type of content. So I'm so ready for this conversation, and I'm sure you will enjoy it too. Courtney, welcome to the show. I'm so stoked. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
I am so excited to be here, you guys.
Yes. By the way, for those listening, if you for some reason hear like a little, crazy hold and we kind of, lose track of things, it's because Courtney right now is going through a hurricane, and she's here committed to Content is Profit to provide you with wins. So don't worry. We'll let you know at the end of the episode if something crazy happens.
Commitment. Talking about commitment.
Tell me.
I just got married.
Hey!
You like that? You like that transition? You like that transition?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Party sounds. But anyways.
I know. I'm a new man. So new man, new questions, new podcasting vibe. Who knows? We'll see.
Boy. Yeah.
This is my first episode as a married man. So
it's not about you, Fonzie. It's about Courtney.
I just wanted to share the news. I'm excited. I'm pumped. I'm
honored to be here. The first episode as a married man. That is really cool.
I know.
Appreciate it, Courtney. No pressure at all. Yeah.
Courtney, we've had a couple of calls together. I've jumped on your show. You gave me incredible feedback. You've helped so many people rank on Podcast Launch. I have a number here. Like the proven PodLaunch formula has helped 95% of clients break the Apple top 100 in the category in like their respective categories and scale their podcast 5 times faster than those who start a podcast without it. I want to start with that because that's such a powerful statement. Courtney, how do you do it? How do you get to that? How do you rank so often, so high? What's the secret?
Yeah, honestly, let me caveat this and say, just so that we're all on the same page here, the charts are a wonderful avenue of discoverability. It's like the top way that people find new podcasts outside of word of mouth and outside of using the search feature. So it's kind of like being on the first page of Google when someone's searching for your thing. They're going to scroll through the first page. Nobody really goes to the second page unless they need to. And nobody clicks past page 2 of Google. So think of it that way when you're ranking your podcast. That is the benefit. That is why we want to be on the charts, just to be able to increase that visibility and that discoverability. However, the charts are not the ultimate end-all be-all measure of success for your podcast. And I say this out the gate before we dig into numbers, before we dig into how to get on the charts, because a lot of people will set their sights on that and be like, the charts, I got to get on the charts. I need to have a top 100 podcast. When really at the end of the day, there are so many different reasons why we podcast.
Yeah.
There are so many different reasons. Maybe you're podcasting for lead gen. Maybe you want to convert listeners to clients. Maybe it's targeting guests to convert those to clients. Maybe you want to turn the podcast into its own stream of revenue and into a business itself. Maybe you're just looking to leave a legacy and you want to get your message out into the world in a bigger way. There's a lot of different reasons. It could be a combination of all of the above. The charts are one way that we can look at getting discovered. It's a tool for that, but it's also not like the end all be all metric. So if you're listening right now and you have a podcast and you're like, oh, I've never been on the charts, or like I've gotten there once or twice, or that's not possible for me. I have a small audience. It feels totally out of reach. The beautiful thing about the charts is anybody can get there. And with our clients, one of the things that we dig into first, and look, this is going to sound so generic because a lot of people talk about this, but a lot of people are not doing this, is who is your podcast for? Because if you can't tell me, and not just demographically, because a lot of times I'll ask that question and people will be like, oh, well, they're, a 32-year-old guy who lives this, who does this, and, they have this career and that thing. But if you can't tell me the exact problems that your podcast is here to solve in detail with specificity, we have a problem right there. Because if you're not clear on it, your listeners won't be either. And so the very first step before we can even talk strategy and like, what do you do? How do you get on the charts and all that stuff? We got to make sure your podcast messaging is dialed in, because otherwise we can throw all the strategies at the wall that we want.
Yeah.
But they're only going to work to some degree because you'll have a leaky bucket. You'll be sending all this traffic to your show, but people won't be sticking. Yeah. So that's thing number one. From there, though, once you get that messaging dialed in, well, then it's simply a matter of knowing what triggers the algorithms on Apple and Spotify. And then how can you leverage that with the network and the community that you have, whether it's 100 people on your email list or 10,000 people on your email list or 100,000 people in your community. Doesn't matter the size. How can we leverage what you have in order to trigger those algorithms and show, the Apple podcast gods that your podcast has high listener engagement and therefore is worth sharing. It's worth showing to more people. It's worth getting in the feeds of more listeners.
Yeah. Courtney, I love that. And, as you were saying that, and, the word algorithm comes up often, right? And especially with content, people want to go to YouTube and whatever. And I feel like the general sense is like these platforms are playing against us, right? Like that's the feeling I get every time we have a conversation about algorithms. It's like, no, YouTube is against me. They don't show me. And it's like, we're so easy at pointing fingers, right? And it comes down to our message and like, are we actually providing a solution to somebody else's problems? Are we actually providing good entertainment for that other person, right? Because like these platforms is in their best interest to show your podcast if it makes people happy, right? Like they make money off of that. So I think like that's also something that I feel every time we have this conversation, we have to bring awareness to, because a lot of people are like, well, I've been an expert on this field for so long, or I know about this topic because of XYZ, right? But maybe we're not good storytellers. Maybe we're not good creators, right? Maybe we don't know how to frame a problem in a specific way so people on the other side can understand it, right? And we're victims of it. Like I raised my hand, right? Like was it the technobabble era that we went through, or I went through really hard? Yeah. I was just like super into like, the specifics, and I will dive in. Fonzie will be like, stop. You're technobabbling, right? How do we make it simple and how do we get better? So I think like, I want to add that a little asterisk to everything that you said, which is completely true, but also it's like, how do we look inwards to work on that messaging, which is so important for this. And as you're mentioning, like, who's your specific person? I remember this specific girl, like she is in Europe, single mom, and she would listen. She sent us a message and she explained that she would listen to our show at night when she was putting her baby down and, when she was with her, and it inspired her to start creating. And I'm like, wow, what a vivid picture of like who we're helping, right? Because sometimes we go into specific tactics, sometimes we go into specific strategies, but also we share a lot of stories of success that people are like doing it, right? And I think like that's on our side, that makes it. So, maybe if we picture that person or who makes that comment back to you, be like, oh man, your show, that episode really helped me. I think it's going to help people get to that a little bit faster. So thank 100%. You for that clear explanation and to rewind, we had the 3 ways to find your podcast, the reason why we podcast, and who's your podcast for, man. I think that's incredible. And not a lot of people are asking those questions.
And basing it on a real person is really key. It's really key, just to point that out too, because a lot of times people say, oh, go come up with your listener avatar and this and that. And it's like, if at the end of the day, it's not a real person, then you're going to just be creating like fluff for nobody. It's like, who are we actually creating for? Yeah. So I always tell people, like, if you can picture someone that you've worked with, that if they were the most perfect fit client for you and you would work with them 20 times over if you could. And if every client could be exactly like them, well, let's create for them, and knowing in detail, the specificity is important too. Knowing in detail what keeps them up at night, What are the industry norms or beliefs that they're buying into right now that is keeping them from getting what they want? What is it that they're getting what they want? And what do they think the problem is? Not to what do you as the expert know the problem is?
Yeah.
Because then there's a mismatch in communication. We're speaking from our level of awareness, not their level of awareness. But what do they think the problem is, or what is the problem that they're experiencing in their life right now? And can we paint that picture? Just like you said, Louise, that picture is so detailed by, that woman that you thought of. Like, we need to be able to communicate at that level of detail too for our audience, because that's what's going to get the unconscious mind to lean in and go, yeah, this is for me.
I have question. I might butcher a little bit. It's kind of like formulating in my head right now. But, the way you're sharing about this.
Are you married, Fonzie?
I am married, first of all. So ladies, back off. So the way you're explaining this, obviously, I think we're talking on the expert-based businesses services, right? As somebody that is solving a very specific problem. So one of the challenges that we've noticed, for example, when we store data, right? Because we talk on a specific problem, right, on our podcast for the most part, is that we have decent numbers, but then people consume for a few episodes and maybe they move on to the next podcast, right? So our growth hasn't been like, I would say too crazy, but is good. Like, it's like stable. But when we had a conversation, I don't remember who we had a conversation with, they said that they were like, oh, those are actually always new listeners. Like, your challenge is actually retaining people for multiple episodes, right? So when I'm listening to what you're saying right now, I'm like, all right, this is great. I'm curious now on, let's say we do the launch, we have this first wave of listeners. Are you creating this podcast, knowing that the audience is going to turn around after a specific amount of episodes? Are you planning for that in a way, right? Because when you have a podcast that is on a very specific problem, that's going to happen. People are going to be like, right, I know enough about this topic, I'm going to take action. Or now I have a different problem that I need solving, right? It's not quite as the podcast, like, I don't know, Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan, like this personality-based podcast that they talk about multiple topics and they bring different experts on different things and, kind of like always feeding your curiosity. So I'm extremely curious, like based on what you talk about, expert-based podcasts that solve a very specific problem. When we launched them, and we ranked, what is the, not expectation, right? But what can they hope for after, right? Like, what do they need to learn? Are they going to retain that audience and grow it like sporadically? Or, is there going to be some turnaround and they can expect those same numbers as they go?
Courtney, have you seen Avengers? The movie Avengers?
A long time ago.
Yeah.
A really long time ago.
So I just it reminded me of like Thanos, right? Saying churn is inevitable. What is it? Inevitable. Is that the right word?
I don't know.
Like, it always happens. It's like, am I wrong?
It always happens.
How can we keep them all?
Yeah. Well, and that's what you have to solve for. It's exactly that. And one of the things too, and I'll also say this, a lot of people think, well, my podcast doesn't solve a problem because it's entertainment focused or it's community focused, or, hey, we have a nonprofit podcast. It's really, we're trying to do good in the world, And at the end of the day, I believe every podcast solves a problem, because why do people listen to Joe Rogan?
Yeah.
To be entertained, maybe to be distracted. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they need to take their mind off of something else that's going on in their lives that they need to refocus on, and that outlet to be able to say, okay, this is the highlight of my day right now. So dig deep and figure out, like, even if you're not an expert podcast, what problem do you solve for people? Why do you exist? Why do they listen? From there, though, we absolutely want to solve for attrition, because it's going to happen. The podcasting growth game, it's just the name of the game is attract and retain. Attract and retain. That's how we grow a listener base. If you're really good at attracting, but you're not good at retaining, you have no way to grow. If you're really good at retaining, but you're not good at attracting, you have no way to grow. So the launch is definitely designed to help you get visible for the first time. And it's also to signal over those first 8 weeks to the algorithms, like, hey, people are liking the show. It's getting traction. It's getting some engagement, all that good stuff. But to your point, Fonzie, like, what happens after that? And so this is where we go back to the messaging piece, where with how aligned is your content to the listener that you're looking to attract? Yeah. And then how aligned is the positioning of your show to attract that specific listener. Because we want to make sure that when they're searching, let's say for a keyword, that your podcast is one of the top 5 that pops up before they have to scroll their phone. And there's little things that we can do, not just from a content perspective, but also from the messaging that people see, which messaging is just visual, written, and spoken. So it's what they read, it's what they see when they're encountering your podcast, and then eventually it's what they hear after you convince them to click play. So the messaging is what attracts them. The content is what keeps them listening and keeps them coming back. So it's a 1-2 part of the equation. And if you have one without the other, it's going to be difficult to grow, because then we could go out and put any strategy in place, but we're only going to see some success with that strategy.
Yeah. Can you give us like some specific examples of like how somebody can rework a little bit of that message, right? To, let's say the show is already running, right? And I'm assuming similar if it's like a new show or somebody, so a lot of people are like, oh, I have to like redo a whole show. I think that's a myth. It's like you can relaunch the same show, right? And I remember we experienced something similar when we announced Hotspot. We did somewhat of a strategy to like relaunch the show to the world. And we brought a bunch of people that have been on the show. We did like a 5-hour like live stream and thing. And it shot us in the ranks and I think it was like attention went back to that, right? So we attached it to that event. So what's something specifically that, you know, people might be able to do this afternoon even? Like how can they rework their messaging? How can we rework the structure that maybe we have the podcast on and provide a win?
Or is it a matter of driving a lot of traffic at the same time? You know, like I'm curious too.
It's all of the above. Okay, so let's break down the messaging piece, and then we'll break down the launch piece, because these are really 2 pillars of a 3-part formula here. So the first pillar with the messaging, like I said, it starts with getting clear on who you are here to serve. And when I say in detail, there's a difference between saying, all right, I have a podcast for overwhelmed parents of toddlers, versus saying, if you're an overwhelmed parent of a toddler, like the word overwhelm is so subjective, it's only going to capture some people's attention. And the problem with it is other people are using the same terms. So it's not going to make you stand out from the competition because, well, they're also targeting overwhelmed parents of toddlers. Yeah. But if you can say, I am a nutrition coach for parents of 2-year-olds. And if you are a parent of a 2-year-old and you are sick and tired of your kid flinging their plate off the dinner table every night after they told you that was exactly what they wanted to eat, I can help you. Right? There's just a difference there where we can paint that visual picture for someone. And it's
what's
like,
that show?
okay,
I need it. What, is that a real show?
You know, it's like, okay, well, that's where the overwhelm comes from. This is one simple thing that you can do. Look through all your podcast messaging, your podcast title, your episode titles, your episode descriptions. Notice anywhere, I call them feeling words. Notice anywhere that you use feeling words: stressed, frustrated, anxious, overwhelmed. And ask yourself, well, what's causing them to feel that way? What's actually happening in their life that's causing them to have that feeling? And that's going to automatically right there take you one level deeper. There's a lot of ways that we can make something really specific, and that with things that we can add into the language to make something specific. But that question right there will take you a level deeper than most people are doing. And it's going to help you stand out more because most people are not communicating in that way. Yeah. So that's one example there. But then from there, yes, we want to drive traffic to the show. And that's part of what's built into the launch strategy that we teach, which is, you know, like I said, I caveated this at the beginning. The charts are not the end all be all. And here's why. Because the charts fluctuate every week. Yeah. There are natural fluctuations that happen in the charts every week. So yes, you might launch, and because you're intentionally driving that traffic over a 24-hour window, the goal is to rank. Why? Because we want to know how many downloads, how much traffic it's going to take to keep you ranking. Then we can begin to build a growth strategy around that to help consistently drive that traffic over time. And we've had clients who've done this, and there are many of them. I could tell you so many stories, but one of them in particular, she launched her podcast about 4 years ago. She ranked when she launched it, got a lot of traction out the gate. She's consistently released an episode every week since then. She's now in the top, I think 1.5% on listen notes, which we know that takes into account all total podcasts, even those that aren't active. Yeah. But most people who have podcasts aren't even showing up in listen notes, right? Like with their ranking. So like, it just goes to show like she's been doing the right activity over this span of time. Yeah. That momentum and that traction has continued to build. And her podcast is her number one source of clients for her business. Yeah. So yeah, it takes time, but also we got to make sure that we know what levers to pull in order to bring about the results that you want.
I love it. As you were sharing the example about the feeling words and all this, I remember, I think people start podcasts for the wrong reasons. Right. I think people start podcasts because they want to get famous, because they want to, have this like crazy attraction, come listen to me. And, I'm the expert, right? But I had this epiphany as you were explaining this, right? In the mornings, we have a new school for Luca, right? And I'm like, okay, I have these problems. I have the problem that it's a 30-minute drive to get to that point. And I've been having a blast, but sometimes, they don't want to listen to Papa talk, right? All the time. Or when I pick him up, right? I also have the problem that I want to teach Luca Spanish, right? In a fun way, and kind of review the lessons that they're reviewing in school. So I'm like, okay, well, I have these problems that make me feel sometimes overwhelmed, right? Because maybe I'm not dedicating the time, or, for whatever reasons, we always feel a little guilty, like, all this stuff, right? It's like, what can we create that for 25 minutes, because I see all the parents in drop-off lines, to make life a little bit easier for these parents. So it's like the drop-off stories, right? So it's like, it could be a podcast for kids that parents and kids can enjoy together during drop-off times or pick-up times that are normally 15 to 20 minutes, right? And as soon as that kid jumps on, he's excited to listen to the story and learn something cool, right? And that was an epiphany I had like driving back, and he solves a very specific problem, right? And then, my marketing mind went like, oh, this is crazy. I'm like, how many parents are on drop-off lines, every single day? And like, but it started with a problem that I had, right? With our show too, the problem initially that it solved was, we were very curious about how other people were turning their content into profit. We want to learn from the best and take, nuggets here and there and kind of document that. And it has shifted quite a bit. So thank you for like illustrating that. And it's more as in, how can we add value to that person that experiencing that same problem, that we might be having, or like the same problems that we had maybe five years ago, right? So the thing is like, instead of looking at us, I'm like, this podcast is going to do so much for us. It's like, how can this podcast do so much for them? Am I right? Am I just
spot on? So and also to point out too, I mean, with that example, what you're describing is not an expert focused podcast. Nope. It's not like, oh, I'm going to sit here and teach you, how to grow your business to 8 figures. Like, no, it's an entertainment podcast, but yet it still solves a problem. And you said something there that is so good. And I want to call this out, because this is the shift that needs to happen mentally for us to be able to fully take ownership of our podcast, to really show up in that way that everybody says, like, we need to serve, we need to add value. But how do you actually do that? So what you said was, it solved a problem that I had. And I feel like for at least those of us that are entrepreneurs and business owners, how many businesses are created because it solved a problem that you had?
Yeah.
And for the same reasons, that's why a lot of podcasts exist too, because it solves a problem that you had. So if you can just like go back in time and think about, where were you at that point in your life, not from this expert level of awareness that you might have now, but then what were the problems that you were experiencing that maybe you started your business to solve in the first place? And then, yes, flipping the script on making your podcast, I call it egocentric versus listener-centric. If you have an egocentric podcast, which, look, I'm guilty. The first several years of my podcast, I was in it for me. I wasn't in it for my listeners. Yeah. I thought my listeners wouldn't know that, because I'm like, oh, I want to be this expert and this top thought leader and blah, blah, blah. No, it was the worst mentality that I could have approached it with, because it prevented me from being able to show up and serve my listeners. It was the thing getting in the way. And we're humans. At the end of the day, I mean, look, if 93% of communication is nonverbal, do you think listeners are picking up on that? Yes, they're not picking up on what you're saying, the 7% that is words. They're picking up on the 93%. And if your energy is that, I'm the expert, and you should listen to me because I'm great, like, listeners are going to feel that way. And I know this is not often a conscious thing. There are people listening right now that are like, I don't do that. But yet maybe you're doing it, you're not fully aware of it, but that is the mental shift that needs to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about attract and retain. I think there's another part in there as well, which is conversions. Right now, I'm looking at your website. You recently did a Q&A around that, growth or conversions, right? But I'm curious, right, on that part of the process, on what you do when you're running these launches for the podcast, right? Is there a specific point of leverage, right, that you would recommend people to focus on, besides obviously knowing exactly who they're talking to, what problem, and I'm guessing, having as well some sort of product or something, right, that people want to get. How do you get people to actually move from the platform to take action, right? It's known that people that listen to podcasts, they have more purchasing power, right? There's been research done into that, and everybody wants a piece of the pie. Everybody comes in and is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make some money, right? with this podcast. We started it like that, right? We started like, oh, we're gonna get thousands of people to get our lead magnets, and they're gonna go through our funnels, Everything changed real quick. We realized that was not the model that worked for us. And then, like you said, right, after making it for them, being of value, rather than making it egocentric, like we realized for us, it was more of a relationship building show. But I'm curious, right, again, based on the expert-based businesses that are making this podcast, right? What are maybe some of these conversion levers that you've seen, or not only that, right? Like what some of the conversion methods? You already kind of mentioned that there's different types of that they can do.
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. How do we move people to action? Because if you're an expert-based business and you're launching your podcast as a lead generation tool, then your number one goal is most likely going to be to drive traffic back to your business. It's a great way to monetize a podcast because you keep 100% of the creative control and 100% of the profit. But some people also want to turn the podcast itself into a revenue stream. And we work with people who are like, I don't have a business behind the podcast and I don't want a business, yet they still are an expert in their own right with sharing their message. Maybe they're a public speaker, an author, this sort of thing. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, whether you want sponsors and advertisers, or whether you ultimately want to drive traffic back to your own thing, the same conversion principles apply. And so whenever we're looking to move traffic, there's some very practical things we can do, which we'll dig into. And then there's also the psychology piece of it. So the psychology piece, we've unpacked that a lot already, which is knowing what you solve for and also helping people see that your solution, creating that natural desire and demand for it because they're trusting you as the expert. I'm gonna give you an example. So let's say that you have like this stomach ache that keeps happening and it's like 11 o'clock every night and it's been happening for the last week and it wakes you up at night and now you're kind of getting concerned because you're like, all right, I thought it would go away. It's been going on for a week. Like maybe I should go get this checked out. So you go to the doctor and you're like, okay, look, you tell him all the symptoms. I've been having this problem. And he's like, yeah, some of our patients do complain about that. Let me write you this prescription. Go take this. Come back in a week if it's still bothering you. Now, there's a segment of the population that will go do that and they will be maybe fine in a week and they'll never follow up. And that's that. That segment of the population is called not your ideal listener. That is not the people that we are going after, right? We want the people who want to figure out why the pain is happening in the first place and how to solve for it for good without just like throwing Band-Aids at the issue. So let's say you're one of those people and you're like, all right, I need a second opinion. That first doctor, he didn't really take his time with me, wasn't listening. So you go and you find another doctor and they sit down with you. They make you feel like you were the only patient in the office that day. And he says, now, when did this start happening? And you're like, well, about a week ago. And he said, and it happens at night, doesn't it? It wakes you up. You're like, yeah, how did you know that? Probably around, 11 o'clock midnight. And you're like, wait a minute. How did you know that? And the doctor proceeds to tell you the symptoms and in such detail that you're like, okay, first of all, not only does this doctor know what they're talking about, surely they must also have the solution. And I want whatever the solution is because you get it, right? And not so what just happened in that exchange right there is that, first of all, that doctor was filling one of the 5 emotional needs that we all have as human beings. No matter race, creed, color, background, we all have these 5 emotional needs. And one of them is to feel heard and to feel understood. So a lot of times what people say, and we'll talk about like problems, right? And we've been taught to speak to the pain. And there's a lot of like bro marketing out there where people are like, oh, hitting you over the head with the pain. You're a terrible person because you have this problem. We're like shaming you for it. Like, that's not what we're doing here. We're just communicating in a way that shows someone we understand the problem with such a level of specificity that not only will earn their trust, but would also increase their belief in you that you have the solution. That's what has to happen before the action can take place, before they go click through to get on your email list or join your workshop or purchase your thing or book a call or whatever it is. So that piece has to happen first. And we can begin to create that natural desire and demand throughout our episodes as we speak to the problems. We're also going to be creating relief for them. They're going to feel relief. And then to the point about how podcasting just comes with so much purchasing power, there was a study that was done, I think Vox Media did it recently, where podcast hosts, people trust them 5 times more than, like, remember those TV celebrities that would come on? I mean, look at like Air Jordans, right? They come and they endorse a product. It might be a TV media person or like a celebrity. And you'd be like, oh, I got to have that, right? And 7 times they trust people, podcast hosts, 7 times more than they trust internet influencers, right? And there was like the internet influence era where people were like, oh, the influencer, the almighty influencer, and now that's kind of behind that, right? Like podcast hosts have the most authority and trust building abilities than pretty much any other type of quote unquote influencer out there. Yeah. And so when you think about that, it's really just the purchasing power is there. Your audience wants to take action. We have to figure out what's preventing them from taking action right now. So a lot of times it comes back to the messaging. It comes back to how you're positioning what you do. If you're always just like pushing your offer as the solution, they're not going to trust you because they're going to see through that and be like, oh, you're just trying to make a sale. We need to actually push, like, what is the solution that your offer can help them achieve? Well, now we're talking. So then it comes down to the strategy of this. Okay, so let's say, and this was something that we did not realize was a problem with our podcast for a very long time until I dug into the data and was like, oh, no wonder people aren't converting from the show because they're not even hearing the call to action. At the time, we had like 32 minutes was like our average episode length.
Yeah. And
my calls to actions were always at the end of the episode. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. We're not getting any leads from the podcast right now. Like, what is happening? This is strange. Like, why are people not converting? And then of course, this is where a lot of people experience this problem and they're like, okay, I'm going to go change up the lead magnet, or I'm going to change the call to action, or I'm going to, try to change like whatever it is that they're saying to try to get people to action. And when I looked at our listener consumption, people were consuming like 60% of the episode. That's like around 18 minutes. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, that's why it's happening, because they're not even hearing the freaking call to action at the end of the episode. Yeah. So we shortened the length of our episodes. And look, I'm giving this not as blanket advice. You're going to have to do these numbers for yourself to see where your listener consumption is, right? But for us, it meant shortening the episode. Now our episodes are around 18 to 20 minutes. And the calls to actions are embedded a little bit before the end of the episode. And now you can go look in our sales leads list and you can see where people are saying like, where did you hear about us? Where did you hear about it? Podcast, longtime listener, podcast, longtime listener. And it's like, okay, that's cool. Working. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now it's working.
So cool.
And as we hit the 29th minute on an episode, you can go to now. Kidding.
But not for real. If you want any help with like content ecosystems and content, you just reach out to us on social media.
I love it. That was some good advice, by the way.
You mentioned data, right? You mentioned metrics, right? As we're diving in, we talked a lot in the past about your 7-day, your 30-day, obviously your consumption. We use a few platforms to kind of monitor this. Like on our side, we publish from Megaphone, right? Then we have Chartable. Chartable recently went through like a blackout thing where like no data was coming through, so everything was wrong for a few weeks. What is like the key metrics for long form podcasting that like the ones that you guys help launch and produce that you guys are always looking for, and how can people find those, right? It can be somewhat overwhelming, right? And you also have the caveat of video content as well, right? You have your, in our specific case, you have your main episode audio, your video, and then you have your clips, right? In our specific case, clips drive a lot of subscribers for YouTube, but then the longer consumption happens on the audio podcast, right? So it's almost like YouTube keeps us in mind of that type of audience. Some of them translate into podcast listeners. They're a different type of consumer as well. So what are some of the things that you look for? As soon as we start doing the YouTube funnel, it can get very overwhelming, right? And then with audio podcast, it's not very clear. A lot of platforms say different numbers. Like, what do you look for?
Yeah, this is a great question. There's so much to unpack here. I feel like we have to reverse engineer the process a little bit. So a lot of times what'll happen is people will go out and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to post on social media. I'm going to start a YouTube channel and do these things to drive traffic back to the podcast. And they'll try to track and see like how many people are going back to the podcast and all of this, Whereas really, let's start by looking at the people that you already have listening to the podcast. How long are they listening? Listener consumption is one of those metrics that is getting a lot of buzz right now, but it's a metric that also didn't always used to be available to us. Like this didn't exist until a few years ago. And so, digging into that data, If you want to look at it kind of loosely on the surface, go to Apple Podcasts, your podcast connect Apple. If your podcast is listed on Apple, it's going to give you that data for those episodes. You can run those averages, total up the last 10 episodes that you have, see how the average length is and see how long people are listening on average. And then you can base a lot of decisions from there because there are a lot of listeners. And in our instance, right, this may not be true for everyone, but in our case, over 70% of our listeners listen on Apple. So for us, that gives us a pretty good read on the majority of our listener base to say like, okay, this is probably pretty applicable across the board. If you want to go a level deeper, you can dig into that on Spotify as well. And that can give you more of a complete picture. A lot more listeners are starting to listen on Spotify. They're picking up some traction there. So we definitely want to look at, how long are listeners listening? Are people dropping off? This is where the Spotify data can also be really interesting because they also show like the number of impressions your podcast is getting versus the number of plays and where in the episodes people are dropping off. Are they listening to a minute, to 3 minutes, to 5 minutes? Are they getting through the whole thing? Are they coming back for more? So these types of things can begin to help us figure out, and your listeners will tell you through the data what they want. What topics do they want more of? This is another thing that we look at, which is which episodes have the highest consumption and which ones really peaked in terms of 7-day downloads, where they outpaced other episodes in terms of initial 7-day downloads, because that will clue you into what topics to talk about more often. Maybe bring on a guest expert to talk about that or approach that topic from a different angle. And that can help on the content side to really figure out, okay, this is more of what my audience wants. Let me create more content like that. Because then in turn, when you're kind of applying back some of those messaging principles we were talking about, if you're doing SEO for your podcast, right, you can begin to then reverse engineer and say, okay, I know this is what listeners want. We've got that piece dialed in. We know listeners are sticking around. They're coming back for more. That seems to be working. Focus there first. Yeah. Now let's figure out how we can get more people to the show. And so that's where for us, this kind of gets kind of fun with the content. Where like with Instagram right now, what we're testing is, if I do like a little short form clip, I don't do them all the time, but if I do them, I'm giving them value in that clip and in the caption so that if they never go back to the podcast, they've still gotten value from something that I've put out into the world. But then I'm also opening a loop and giving them a reason to go listen to the podcast because they're going to want to close that loop in their brain to go get the answer. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say, comment below the episode number. And then we have a mini chat automation that goes in and sends them the link to the episode. And we get a lot of people doing that. So that's really interesting because then you can begin to start to see like, okay, where are people coming from? How are we converting that traffic? And then, but first fix the leaky holes in your bucket. Yeah. And then you can start figuring out, okay, now where are we driving that traffic? Where are they coming from?
Oh, so good. I recently fighting the microphone over here. I see. One of the episodes we recorded, maybe the last 60 days or so, was about the hook to a girl, Haley, something on that. We're like kind of breaking down what happened socially and on content and what she was doing. And that has been like a 10x download compared to any others on YouTube specifically, because there's a lot of people that consume that. And, the click-through rate was probably the highest that we've seen also in the 90 days. And it's like an example of maybe this event is happening and you kind of ride that wave on that topic, but also it can be an indicator, but at the same time, I think is a double-edged sword because we personally don't like doing a lot of that type of content, right? So it's like, okay, where do I concede, right? And I think is that the compromise that we have to go back and forth. Because it's really simple. Last night at the time of this recording was the presidential debate, right? So we could potentially grab some of that and be like, okay, through the lens of content profit, what are some lessons that we can extract from here, right? Type of deal. But sometimes maybe that's not the content that we really feel fulfilled to do, right? So I think it's to me, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but that's how I feel today with so much stuff. It's how much do we cater for what people are actually looking for, but does that actually help the people that really want to help? And also ultimately it helped me, because if I don't enjoy the process of creation, then nothing comes out and then I don't help anybody, right? So I think it's important 100%. to understand at least that and be okay with that, right? Because Fonzie likes certain type of topics. I like certain type of topics. We can experiment and we can, once we create it, we're like, hey, is this something that we really enjoy doing? And then how are people responding to that? And then if you really enjoy doing it, but there's no response from people, then we don't have to blame others. It's okay, it's our decision to continue this path, but the consequence is that maybe we have less consumption on the other side, right? So it's almost like a give and take, and it's this constant, battle. And I feel like if we go too far on both ends, then we don't end up fulfilled in any, like we don't help anybody or we don't help ourselves in the sense of creation. And it can be really nasty. So I love that you shared like exactly, what to look for and start improving and getting better, right? And trying to find your own messaging, trying to find your own motivation to continue to create. So cool.
Yeah. Well, and also exactly what you just said there, which is if you're not excited to create it, that energy is going to come through and ultimately that's going to work against you. The other thing to look at when you are digging into the data, and let's say you do have an episode like that one is a great example where it's like, oh my gosh, it's doing 10x better than any of our other episodes. But was it a fluke? What else could have contributed to the fact that that episode did really well? And like you said, with the debate, that could be that there was a point in time where that topic was trending. Yeah. And so you did kind of capitalize on that a little bit. But maybe it's not something that you're excited about or that you want to continue creating, or that's not going to be trending tomorrow or next week. And so therefore, if you were to release another episode on that, well, you're not going to get the same kind of traction. So instead of looking at, okay, which ones were just the biggest hits, look at which ones are consistently higher. For us, it's anytime we talk about conversions, podcast conversions, those episodes always outperform. It's wild to me, but I'm like, clearly this is what our people love to talk about. They love to know everything about how are we converting listeners. The other metric that I didn't mention a moment ago, this one's a little bit more of like a hidden metric because it's not one that gets talked about a lot, but it's one that has a lot of influence on the podcast charts. And it's new daily followers. New daily followers to the show. A lot of people are always pushing like review the show, rate the show, share the show with your friends. And all that's good and fine. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we should be driving our listeners to hit the follow button. Why? Because it shows intent to listen. And another thing, when it comes to going all in, we touched on this a little bit ago, but like truly being committed to the process of podcasting, that true level of commitment, not everybody has that. Not everybody wants that. And that's okay. Podcasting might not be for you if that's the case, right? But if you really want to grow your show, you have to be fully committed to doing whatever it takes. And like Dave Jackson always says, being willing to do what others won't. Yeah. And so if you're like, okay, I know that new daily subscribers is a really powerful metric. I need to be focusing on that. Now, what activity can I take every day to get my show in front of, let's just start with one new listener. And I'm not saying go post on social media and be like, oh, check the box. I did it. I got my show in front of new listeners today. Right? Like, no, how can you connect with someone? Maybe it's a Reddit thread. Maybe it's a Facebook group. Maybe it's on LinkedIn. How can you get your show in front of them as the solution? Always seeking to help and add value. How can you go in there and maybe answer questions and be like, you know what? I got an episode about this that I think you might love. Would you like me to DM you the link? Yes, please DM me the link. Okay, great. Send them the link. Check the box now, because now you truly have reached someone outside of your warm audience, which are already the people who know, like, and trust you and follow you on social media. It's not going to grow your podcast, just posting to social media. And so really kind of figuring out, okay, here's the metrics that the platforms are looking for. Yeah. Here's the metrics that indicate to me how engaged my community is. Now, how can I leverage those metrics? And to me, the best strategies are the ones that are simple and the most leveraged, where they're easy to execute, and they are helping you get more out of what you're already doing versus adding more to your plate. Yeah.
Yeah. That reminds me of actually Alex Sanfilippo. He came here and he was sharing how for like a year, that's all he did. He would go into groups, and then when people were talking about a specific problem, he would be like, oh, I actually have an episode that talk on that. It's on minute 5. Here, you can listen to it right here. And he would go, and every day he would try to find one person, right? At the end of the year, that's 365 new listeners, or if you're like my brother and he takes multiple days of vacation, it's like maybe 200 new listeners.
Multiple days of vacation. Or like multiple
200 new listeners for the year. Hala Taha is great at this too, over at Yap Media. Okay. I've heard her share on a podcast episode before how she was originally just super scrappy with it. And she would send out 2,500 DMs on LinkedIn, because I don't think LinkedIn either they didn't have a cap or they don't have a cap right on how many DMs you could send out. Yeah. And now they have an automated process in place for this. But she was sending out that volume of LinkedIn messages. I can't remember if it was per day or per week, but it was like a super crazy amount where it's like, okay, that's probably out of reach for most people, but can you reach one new listener a day? Yeah, I think most of us can do that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. As I'm talking about this, I'm thinking, for somebody that has been podcasting for a little bit and has kind of like a roster of guests and episodes that they already have, should be fairly easy, right? Like you can literally have like a little spreadsheet where you have the guest name, the link of the episode, and a column that says problem that it solves. And then you go, podcast launch. There we go. And maybe another one that says minute where that is talked about, and you put the minute where you talked about. It kind of reminds me of somebody, I don't remember where I got this one from, but a lot of people when they are talking and they say, oh, I have this problem. Oh, I have a book for you. I have a book that I just read that, you would love. It's going to solve that problem. And they give people that book. But then the thing is like, well, now I have all this huge book to listen to, right? And yes, ideally we want them to consume the whole episode. But I love that somebody who once said, well, just put a little bookmark where you want them to read and tell them, hey, look, this is, you told me about this problem. This, chapter specifically talks about it. Here you go. And then if they're interested, they will read the rest of the book. And I think it's the same exact thing with podcasting, right? Tell them, hey, here's the episode. In minute 10, we talk about this specific problem that you're having right now. And then if they enjoy it, they might just give it a listen and then start listening to other of the episodes as well.
Totally. Yeah. Also, this brings to mind that there's like this old saying, like in the copywriting world, like your goal is not to get them to read the whole thing. It's just to get them to read the next sentence. And the same is even going back to listener consumption. Like we had a listener question come in that an episode just released on the podcast talking about this. How do we get listeners listening longer? How do we keep them hooked? How do we get them coming back right now? How do we actually do that? And, it's a valid question, but also my advice, I was like, wait a minute. First of all, the goal is not to get them to listen till the end. The goal is to get them to listen till the end of the first minute, and then the end of the next minute, and then the end of the next minute. And how are we keeping them hooked throughout the whole episode? So now they're getting to the end and wanting to come back for more. So it's kind of the same thing, right? Where it's like, here's a carrot on the stick. I'm going to show you exactly how to solve this problem. Go to minute 5:07. And then usually for context, they're going to listen a few minutes before or after. And hey, they might even listen to the whole thing. And maybe you will pick up a new follower for your show for life. You never know.
Mm-hmm. It's, I think, the Japanese with anime have that figured out. It's crazy. I don't know if you watch any of that, Courtney, but there's been some shows.
We're nerds out here. We're nerds.
That me and Fonzie sometimes start watching, and I have to be very careful because if I start episode 1, they're so good at creating a hook at the end of the episode that you're like, I gotta go to bed, but I cannot live without knowing what's happening next. And it's like you move into the next episode. So, consumption of that type of media where it's like, okay, these people, they need to maintain audiences. Not for just the next episode, but also they have to get them excited because they have to wait a week till the next episode get released, right? So I think that's a good example. And I go back and should we produce the episodes that way where we kind of stop the episode halfway through and we're like, hey, by the way, the secrets, come back to the next episode. And then halfway through the next episode, that's a new guest starts. I think that could be a cool concept. But anyways,
I think that would piss people off.
No, if the episode is released, no. I'm just saying.
Well, here's what I would say. Okay, this is how I always break it down is, okay, if you're going to open loops in an episode, which is a age-old psychological trick. Netflix does it, Hulu does it, animated, everybody does it on other platforms. Why are you not doing it for your podcast? Because our brain doesn't like to have unanswered questions and we don't like to have open loops. It creates a natural tension that we want to bring to resolution. So I say open loops throughout the entire episode. And you can kind of look at it like this, where it's like, okay, the carrot on the stick. Let's say, okay, I'm going to break down the 3 things to help you do X, Y, Z. And you're really going to love number 3 because it's going to help you solve this problem and achieve this benefit. Well, now you've just opened a loop because, okay, maybe they want to just jump straight ahead to number 3, but usually we're sequential in the way we think as humans. We're I'm going to listen to number 1 because then it's going to probably number 2 is going to stem from then to number 3, right? So now we're already future pacing them within the episode itself. And then I do this at the end of every single episode. I've been doing it since day 1. And I'm like, coming up in the next episode, here's the problem we solve to help you achieve this thing. Yeah. And so it's carrot on a stick. And here's where people get this wrong, where in the episode, they're teasing stuff. And then if you were to just kind of end it and be like, come back next week, well, you're going to erode trust because people are going to be like, you just wasted my time. Right. So we want to make sure we're delivering on the promise of the episode and then opening a loop at the end for the next episode. And that works really well.
Yeah. I love how you put it. I'm on board on how you put it, right? Because that is, you're delivering on the promise. sometimes the explanation, the gray line in there is not too clear, and falls into the clickbait side of things. Which
Fonzie speaks to this like this was a strategy that we considered. By the way, no, it was just an example. But I just want to put that out there.
I'm just getting you back in line, back in line.
Courtney, it has been an absolute pleasure having you here in the show. Where can people find you? Where can people find your podcast? Is there any other last tips that you want to share with anybody before we say goodbye?
Thank y'all for having me. This has been such a blast, so much fun. If you are loving this conversation and you want more of these like psychological tips, how do we really tap into? Because at the end of the day, podcasting is all about humans talking to humans. We do forget that. Yeah. But at its core, that's what podcasting is. So when you can understand how your humans think, the people in your audience, it's going to make it so much easier not only to dial in that messaging, but get the positioning right for your show and ultimately grow your show, monetize your show, and convert those listeners to clients. So if you want to come hang out with me on my podcast, you can type my name in whatever podcast platform that you listen to. It'll pop up. Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Podcast is the name of the show. And you can also check us out, podlaunchhq.com, if you want to come hang out with me on one of our live workshops or book a call and talk about next steps as far as getting your podcast launched and ranked.
Yeah. By the way, guys, we jumped on a call with her and it blew our mind. It was so good. I was like, Courtney, we need to be in our lives, together forever and ever. And we share a mastermind. It's so cool. And we're just very blessed to have her in our life and with all the insights that she shares in the industry. So go connect with her. All the links are going to be right here below. Fonzie, anything else that you want to share before we head out?
Just grateful. Thank you. I want to take on the lesson that you just shared, until the next episode, but unfortunately, I don't know exactly what problem and solution we're solving.
But guess what? Your best bro here, Luis, does know, and we have the amazing Corinne Fisher coming next, and she helps local businesses to drive more appointments booked and calls. Let's go.
There we go.
We want to bring people into our shops, whether online or in person, and we want to have them on call so we can help them solve their problem. There you go. Corinne is going to help us do that in the next episode. What about that? Hey,
there we go.
Courtney approved. Courtney approves.
Courtney approved.
There we go. Awesome. Guys, with that said, thank you so much for tuning to the Content is Profit podcast. Go ahead and follow the show in your favorite podcasting platform and on social media at BizBrosCo.
That is right. If Courtney here help you move one step closer towards the growth of your podcast, please don't forget to share this episode. And of course, don't forget to leave a 5-star review, or even better, just hit follow.
Fonzie, the music is over, man. Why you keep talking?
I know. I was adapting, I'm learning.
Bye, guys.